The autumn morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Denver County Courthouse. As Sarah Mitchell stood frozen at the entrance of Courtroom 4, her fingers clutched the worn leather handle of her service dog's harness so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Bailey, her golden retriever, pressed his warm body against her leg, sensing the tsunami of anxiety threatening to overwhelm his handler. "You can do this," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. 3 years, 3 long years since she discovered the truth that had destroyed her career, her reputation, and nearly her life. Today, she would finally speak. The heavy oak doors swung open and the bailiff's voice echoed, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harold Brennan." Sarah's legs moved automatically, carrying her down the center aisle. Every eye in the packed courtroom turned to watch her. She could feel their stares, some curious, others skeptical, a few sympathetic. The clicking of Bailey's nails on the polished floor seemed impossibly loud in the hushed space. Judge Brennan entered from his chambers, his black robe flowing behind him like a dark cloud. At 63, he had the weathered face of a man who'd seen every trick, every lie, every manipulation the legal system could produce. His reputation preceded him, brilliant, exacting, and absolutely intolerant of courtroom theatrics. He'd initially denied Sarah's request to bring Bailey, citing concerns about distractions. It had taken 4 separate motions, a letter from her psychiatrist, and a passionate argument from her attorney before he'd grudgingly approved the accommodation. Sarah took her seat at the witness table and Bailey immediately settled at her feet, his intelligent brown eyes never leaving her face. Across the room, the defense team sat in tailored suits that probably cost more than Sarah's annual rent. At the center sat Marcus Webb, lead attorney for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his smile calculated to project confidence and trustworthiness. Sarah knew better. She'd watched him destroy 3 previous witnesses over the past 2 weeks, twisting their words, exploiting their uncertainties, making reliable experts seem incompetent. Behind the defense table sat the executives she'd once called colleagues. Richard Peterson, her former supervisor, wouldn't meet her eyes. Dr. Catherine Yates, the clinical director who'd signed off on the falsified reports, stared straight ahead with a frozen expression. And in the back, Thomas Crane, CEO of Meridian, radiated the entitled calm of a man who'd bought his way out of every problem he'd ever faced. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Brennan's gravelly voice pulled her back to the present, "please stand and raise your right hand." Sarah rose on shaking legs. The courtroom deputy approached with the Bible, and she placed her trembling hand on its worn leather cover. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," the words barely escaped her throat. "Please be seated." As Sarah lowered herself back into the chair, her fingers found Bailey's soft fur. The connection steadied her, just as it had during countless panic attacks over the past 5 years. Bailey had been with her through the darkest times, through the hospitalization after her breakdown, through the sleepless nights filled with nightmares, through the moments when speaking to another human being felt impossible. The prosecutor, Jennifer Chen, stood and approached with an encouraging smile. "Ms. Mitchell, can you please state your full name for the record?" "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell." "And how were you employed by Meridian Pharmaceuticals?" "I was a senior data analyst in the clinical trials division. I worked there for 7 years." The preliminary questions were easy, almost soothing. Sarah described her education, her role, her responsibilities. She began to relax slightly, her answers coming more naturally. Then Jennifer asked, "Ms. Mitchell, can you tell us about what you discovered in March of 2022? Sarah's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment she'd been preparing for, dreading, and desperately needing for 3 years. "I found a hidden database." "Can you elaborate?" "I was running a routine quality check on our Phase III trial data for Arthro Relief, Meridian's new arthritis medication. I noticed some patient ID numbers were missing from the main database. At first, I thought it was a clerical error, but— Objection! Marcus Webb's voice cut through her testimony like a blade. He rose smoothly, his expression one of practiced patience. Your Honor, the witness is not qualified to testify about database architecture or statistical anomalies. She's not a certified data scientist. Sarah's chest tightened. It was starting already. Judge Brennan looked at Jennifer, counselor. Your Honor, Ms. Mitchell's job was literally to analyze clinical trial data. She's eminently qualified to testify about what she found in the course of her employment. Overruled. Continue, Ms. Mitchell. But the damage was done. Sarah's carefully constructed composure began to crack. Her breathing quickened. The room suddenly felt too hot, too small, too crowded. Bailey shifted, pressing harder against her legs, a warning. He could sense the panic building in her body chemistry, the subtle changes that preceded a full anxiety attack. Ms. Mitchell, Judge Brennan's voice seemed to come from far away. Do you need a moment? And no, Your Honor, I'm fine. But she wasn't fine. Her vision began to blur at the edges. Marcus Webb sat back down and Sarah caught his expression. That slight smirk, that knowing gleam in his eye. He'd researched her. He knew about her PTSD, her anxiety disorder, her history of panic attacks, and he planned to use every bit of it to discredit her before she could expose what Meridian had done. Jennifer Chen continued gently, "Take your time. You were explaining what you found." Sarah forced herself to focus on Bailey's warmth, on the solid reality of his presence. I traced the missing patient IDs to a separate database, a hidden one. It contained adverse event reports that had been deliberately excluded from the data submitted to the FDA. How many reports? 47 cases of severe liver damage. 16 resulted in death. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked once. Order. Sarah continued, her voice stronger now. Meridian knew their drug was killing people, and they hid the evidence. Marcus Webb stood again, his smile predatory. Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness. Judge Brennan nodded. Proceed. As Webb approached, Bailey's ears flattened slightly. Even the dog could sense the threat. Sarah Mitchell's ordeal was about to truly begin. Marcus Webb circled the witness stand like a shark that had detected blood in the water. His Italian leather shoes made soft, deliberate clicks against the courtroom floor, each step calculated to build psychological pressure. Sarah's fingers tightened in Bailey's fur as she watched him approach, her therapist's words echoing in her mind. He'll try to make you doubt yourself. Don't let him. Ms. Mitchell, Webb began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, I understand this must be very difficult for you. Being in a crowded courtroom, all these people staring at you. How are you feeling right now? Sarah's attorney, Jennifer Chen, rose immediately. Objection. The witness's emotional state is irrelevant to— Your Honor, Webb interrupted smoothly, the witness's mental state is entirely relevant to her reliability. I'm simply establishing context. Judge Brennan frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. I'll allow it, but get to your point, Mr. Webb. Webb nodded, turning back to Sarah with that practiced expression of concern that didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Mitchell, how are you feeling? I'm fine. Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. Fine, Webb tilted his head. Even though you're currently receiving treatment for severe anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and you've been hospitalized 3 separate times for psychiatric emergencies. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Sarah felt her face flush hot. Those records were supposed to be private. How did he? Objection. Jennifer's voice rang out sharp and angry. The defense is attempting to prejudice the jury by introducing sealed medical records that have no bearing on. Your Honor, Webb's tone remained infuriatingly calm. The witness's documented history of mental instability directly impacts the credibility of her testimony. The jury has a right to know that Ms. Mitchell has a proven history of paranoid ideation, delusions, and unreliable perception of reality. That's a lie. Sarah's voice cracked as she half rose from her seat. Bailey immediately stood, pressing against her legs, trying to keep her grounded. Judge Brennan's gavel crashed down. Mr. Webb, you will rephrase that statement, or I will hold you in contempt. Ms. Mitchell's medical history does not indicate any such diagnoses. Webb raised his hands in mock surrender. My apologies, Your Honor. Let me rephrase. He turned back to Sarah, and now the false sympathy was gone, replaced by cold precision. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you were dismissed from Meridian Pharmaceuticals for erratic behavior, missed deadlines, and conflicts with supervisors? No, I was fired because I reported. Please answer yes or no. Were you terminated from your position? Yes, but... And isn't it true that you filed for unemployment benefits claiming you were fired without cause, but your claim was denied? Sarah's breathing quickened. He was twisting everything, taking facts and warping them into weapons. The claim was denied because Meridian lied about. Yes or no, Ms. Mitchell, was your unemployment claim denied? Yes, the word felt like defeat. Webb paced back toward the defense table, letting the implication hang in the air. The jury watched with uncomfortable expressions, some sympathetic, others clearly skeptical. He picked up a thick folder and returned to the witness stand. Ms. Mitchell, you claim you discovered this hidden database in March 2022, correct? Yes. And you immediately reported it to your supervisors? Yes, I went straight to Richard Peterson. Straight to Mr. Peterson, Webb repeated, glancing at the jury. And what did Mr. Peterson say? Sarah's chest tightened. This was the part she dreaded. He told me I was mistaken, that I'd accessed old archived data that had already been reviewed and deemed irrelevant. So your supervisor, a man with 20 years of experience in pharmaceutical research, told you that you had misunderstood what you'd found. He was lying to protect the company. Webb's expression didn't change. Or perhaps, Ms. Mitchell, you actually did misunderstand what you were looking at. You said yourself that you're not a certified data scientist. You don't have a PhD in statistics or biostatistics. In fact, you don't even have a college degree, do you? The words hit like physical blows. Sarah felt her throat closing. I left college after my sophomore year because of family circumstances, but I have over a decade of professional experience. A decade of analyzing data under the supervision of actual scientists. But you're not a scientist yourself, are you? I know what I saw. Webb moved closer, his voice dropping to a patronizing tone that made Sarah's skin crawl. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it possible, just possible, that in your emotional state dealing with untreated mental health issues, the stress of your job, that you simply made a mistake? That you misinterpreted some old data and rather than admit the error, you've constructed this elaborate conspiracy theory? Objection. Jennifer was on her feet, argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. Sustained. Judge Brennan's voice held a warning. Mr. Webb, ask questions, don't make speeches. But Webb had accomplished his goal. Sarah could see it in the jurors' faces, doubt, that insidious seed of uncertainty taking root. Her hands trembled visibly now. Bailey whined softly, his wet nose pressing against her palm. Webb changed tactics, his voice hardening. Let's talk about the USB drive you claim contains this evidence. Where did you get it? I copied the files before they could be deleted. So you stole proprietary company data. I was preserving evidence of a crime. Did you have authorization to access these files? I had access as part of my job. Did you have authorization to copy them onto a personal storage device and remove them from company premises? Sarah's mouth went dry. No, but... So you committed theft, corporate espionage, technically. Webb's voice rose, filling the courtroom. You illegally accessed and stole confidential company files, then came here claiming they prove your conspiracy theory. How convenient that these files, which no one else has ever seen, which were allegedly hidden by the company, just happened to be discovered by you alone. How do we know you didn't fabricate them? I didn't, Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. The data is real. People died because of what Meridian did. Or people died because sometimes medications have rare, unpredictable side effects. And you, an unqualified, mentally unstable former employee with an axe to grind, decided to blame my clients for tragedy instead of accepting the reality of medical science. The room spun. Sarah gripped the witness stand rail, her knuckles white. This couldn't be happening. 3 years of fighting, of documenting, of barely surviving, and he was making her sound like a delusional conspiracy theorist. Webb returned to the defense table and picked up another document. Ms. Mitchell, do you recognize this email? Sarah squinted at the paper he held up. It was from her work account, dated 2 weeks before she was fired. I can't see it from here. Allow me to read it for you. This is an email you sent to Mr. Peterson. Quote, I know what you're doing. I know what you're all hiding. You can't silence me. You can't make me disappear. Unquote. Webb looked up at the jury, then back at Sarah. That sounds rather paranoid, doesn't it? I was trying to warn him that I was going to report. Or you were experiencing a mental health crisis and making accusations based on delusions. Stop it, Sarah's voice broke. I'm not crazy, I'm not making this up. Judge Brennan intervened. Mr. Webb, you're badgering the witness. My apologies, Your Honor. But Webb's expression showed no remorse. He moved even closer to the witness stand, looming over Sarah's seated form. Just a few more questions, Ms. Mitchell. After you were fired, you attempted to contact the FDA directly, didn't you? Yes. And they declined to investigate your claims. They said Meridian's data submission had already been reviewed and approved. So the FDA, the federal agency responsible for drug safety, found no merit in your allegations. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes. She wouldn't cry. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. They didn't have access to the hidden database. The database only you claim to have found. The database only you can supposedly prove exists. Webb's voice dripped with skepticism. Ms. Mitchell, how many sleeping pills do you take each night? The question came out of nowhere, catching her off guard. What? Your medical records indicate prescriptions for Ambien, Trazodone, and benzodiazepines. Sometimes all 3 simultaneously. Isn't that correct? I have trouble sleeping because of the PTSD. Do these medications affect your memory, your perception, your ability to distinguish reality from dreams? No, sometimes they make me foggy, but... Sometimes foggy, Webb repeated, turning to the jury. So your memory and perception are sometimes compromised by the multiple psychiatric medications you take daily. Sarah's breathing was rapid now, shallow. The familiar tightness in her chest signaled the beginning of a panic attack. She tried to use her coping techniques, count to 4 breathing in, hold for 4, breathe out for 4. But Webb's relentless assault made concentration impossible. Mr. Webb, Judge Brennan's voice cut through the haze, I think the witness needs a break. Just 2 more questions, Your Honor. Webb didn't wait for approval. He moved to stand directly in front of the witness box, his imposing 6-foot frame creating a physical barrier between Sarah and the rest of the courtroom. More importantly, he positioned himself between Sarah and Bailey. Ms. Mitchell, have you ever been treated for paranoid ideation? No. After what happened at Meridian, I had anxiety. Yes or no? It wasn't paranoid, they really were. Ms. Mitchell, Webb's voice suddenly rose to a near shout, slamming his hand on the witness stand rail. Answer the question, yes or no. The sharp bang of his hand against wood, the aggressive shout, the way he leaned over her, it was too much. Sarah's vision tunneled. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. The courtroom walls seemed to close in. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't speak. And Marcus Webb, seeing her collapse, smiled. Sarah's world narrowed to pinpoint. The fluorescent lights above blazed too bright, burning into her retinas. Marcus Webb's face swam in and out of focus, his mouth moving but the words coming as if through water, distorted, menacing, overwhelming. Her heart pounded a violent rhythm against her ribs, each beat screaming danger, danger, danger. This was it, the full-blown panic attack she'd feared since the moment she'd agreed to testify. The kind that had landed her in the emergency room twice before, convinced she was dying, her body betraying her at the worst possible moment. No, she thought desperately. Not now, not here, not in front of everyone. But her body didn't care about timing or dignity or justice. Her lungs refused to expand properly, each breath coming in short, inadequate gasps. Sweat broke out across her forehead and palms. The courtroom spun sickeningly, the faces in the gallery blurring into a sea of judgment and pity. Webb was still talking, his voice hammering at her like nails. "Ms. Mitchell, I'll ask you one final time. Have you ever experienced delusions or paranoid thoughts that were later proven false?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. Only a small, choked sound that made her cheeks burn with humiliation. She could see the jury watching her, 12 strangers witnessing her complete breakdown. Some looked uncomfortable, others concerned, but a few wore expressions of skepticism that cut deeper than any of Webb's questions. "They think I'm crazy," her mind screamed, "just like he wants them to. They think I'm an unstable woman who made everything up." The thought sent another wave of panic crashing over her. Her vision grayed at the edges, that familiar darkness creeping in that preceded unconsciousness. She'd fainted before during attacks. If she passed out now, on the witness stand, it would destroy any credibility she had left. But through the chaos in her mind, through the roaring in her ears and the steel band crushing her chest, a single thought emerged, clear and sharp as broken glass. Bailey. 5 years of training, hundreds of hours working with her therapist and dog trainer, thousands of repetitions until the response became automatic, hardwired into muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Sarah's left hand, hidden from most of the courtroom by the solid wood panel of the witness box, moved. It was a small gesture. She pressed her palm downward twice in quick succession, fingers spread, the motion practiced so many times it felt like breathing. The signal. Bailey's response was instantaneous and profound. The golden retriever, who had been lying quietly at her feet, rose smoothly to his full height. His brown eyes locked onto Sarah's face with laser focus, reading the micro-expressions that humans missed, the dilation of her pupils, the muscle tension in her jaw, the rapid pulse visible in her throat. Without hesitation, Bailey moved into position. He pressed his solid 80-pound body firmly against Sarah's legs, from her knees to her ankles. The pressure was immediate and grounding, deep pressure therapy, the same technique weighted blankets used, but warm and alive and responsive. The effect was almost magical. The steady, anchoring weight against her legs sent signals to her nervous system, safe, grounded, real, present. Bailey's warmth seeped through her slacks, his breathing slow and steady against her calves, a living metronome she could synchronize with. Sarah's hand dropped from the hidden signal position to rest on Bailey's head, her fingers buried in his soft fur, feeling the solid reality of him. Real. Here. Not a hallucination or delusion or symptom of mental illness, but a highly trained medical intervention standing between her and complete collapse. 4 counts in, she thought, following her therapist's mantra. Bailey's chest rose against her leg, 4 counts hold. His chest held, 4 counts out. His chest fell, 4 counts hold. She matched her breathing to his, using him as an anchor point. The graying at the edges of her vision began to recede. The crushing pressure on her chest eased fractionally. It wasn't gone. Panic attacks didn't disappear in seconds, but it was manageable, survivable. Marcus Webb noticed the movement immediately. His eyes flicked down to Bailey, then back to Sarah's face. For just an instant, something flickered in his expression. Frustration, maybe, or calculation. He'd been so close to breaking her completely, to forcing her off the stand in tears or unconsciousness, proving to the jury that she was too unstable to be believed. But now the dog was interfering with his strategy. Webb made a decision in that split second, one that would prove catastrophic for him and redemptive for Sarah. He stepped deliberately to his left, positioning his body directly between Sarah and Bailey. It was a subtle move that most of the courtroom wouldn't consciously register, but its effect was immediate and devastating. Bailey could no longer see Sarah's face. The golden retriever shifted anxiously, trying to crane his neck around Webb's legs, but the attorney stood firm. Service dogs were trained to maintain constant visual contact with their handlers during anxiety attacks, monitoring for any escalation that might require additional intervention. Webb had just cut that lifeline. "Ms. Mitchell," Webb continued, his voice growing sharper as he sensed her regaining control, "I'm still waiting for an answer. Have you or have you not experienced paranoid delusions?" But he'd miscalculated. By blocking Bailey's line of sight, by literally standing between a disabled person and their medical assistance device, Webb had crossed a line that was written in federal law, and Judge Harold Brennan had seen every second of it. The judge's eyes had been tracking the interaction with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent 4 decades reading body language and courtroom dynamics. He'd watched Sarah give the signal. He'd seen Bailey's immediate, trained response. He'd observed the visible calming effect the dog's pressure therapy had on the witness. And he'd watched Marcus Webb deliberately interfere with that medical intervention. Judge Brennan's face flushed red, a vein pulsing visibly in his temple. His hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. In 42 years of legal practice, first as an attorney, then as a judge, he'd seen plenty of underhanded courtroom tactics. He'd witnessed attorneys bend rules, test boundaries, and play every psychological game in the book. But he had never seen an attorney deliberately interfere with a medical accommodation. It wasn't just unethical, it was potentially illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act. That service dog was the legal equivalent of a wheelchair, an oxygen tank, a hearing aid. Webb might as well have kicked away a witness's crutches. Sarah, still struggling to breathe evenly, felt Bailey straining to see around Webb's legs. The loss of visual contact disrupted the grounding effect. Her panic, which had been receding, surged back with renewed force. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, tears of frustration, fear, and rage at the injustice of it all. Webb saw the tears and pressed his advantage. "Your Honor, the witness is clearly too emotionally unstable to continue. I move that her testimony be stricken from the record and—" "Mr. Webb." The roar came from the bench with the force of a thunderclap. Judge Brennan was on his feet, his black robe billowing around him like the wings of an avenging angel. The gavel crashed down once, twice, 3 times, each strike echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom like gunshots. Every person in courtroom 4B froze. Attorneys stopped mid-motion. Jurors sat up straighter. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenotype machine. Even Bailey paused, his ears swiveling toward the source of the explosive sound. Judge Brennan's voice, when it came again, was low and dangerous, the quiet before a hurricane makes landfall. "Step away from that dog now." Marcus Webb turned slowly, his expression one of confused innocence. "Your Honor, I'm simply conducting my cross-examination." "You are interfering with a medical accommodation in violation of federal law." The judge's voice rose again, shaking with barely controlled fury. That service dog is performing a medical function, and you have deliberately positioned yourself to disrupt that function. I was merely. I don't want to hear it. The gavel came down again, hard enough that Sarah worried it might crack. Bailiff, I want a clear, unobstructed path between the witness and her service dog. I want it now. Move that defense table back if you have to. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man named Torres who'd worked for Judge Brennan for 15 years, leaped into action. He'd never heard that tone from the judge before. He grabbed one end of the heavy oak defense table and began dragging it backward, forcing the entire defense team to scramble out of their seats. Webb stood frozen, his calculated composure cracking like ice under pressure. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. What's irregular, Counselor, is watching an attorney commit a federal violation in my courtroom. Brennan pointed a shaking finger at Webb. You, my chambers, the instant this recess is called, and if you take one step toward that witness or her dog, so help me God, you will spend the night in a cell for contempt. The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Sarah, still fighting for breath, watched through her tears as the defense table was pushed back a full 6 feet. Bailey immediately adjusted his position, moving so he could see her face again while maintaining the deep pressure against her legs. The moment their eyes met, Sarah felt the panic begin to ebb once more. Bailey's expression was steady, unwavering, full of the unconditional support that only a service dog could provide. His tail gave a slight wag, not playful but reassuring. I'm here. You're safe. We've got this. Judge Brennan's voice cut through the chaos one more time. This court is in immediate recess. Everyone remains seated except Ms. Mitchell, who may take all the time she needs to recover from this incident. The way he said incident made it clear he considered it assault. Sarah buried her face in Bailey's fur as the privacy screen was erected around her, finally allowing herself to break down completely, knowing that, for the first time since this nightmare began, someone in power was actually on her side. The privacy screen now surrounded Sarah like a fragile fortress, blocking her from the curious and judgmental eyes of the packed courtroom. Behind it, she collapsed forward, her face pressed into Bailey's neck, her entire body shaking with sobs she'd held back for too long. The golden retriever remained perfectly still, his training overriding any instinct to move, providing the stable anchor she desperately needed. I can't do this, she whispered into his fur. I can't, he's going to win. They're all going to think I'm crazy. Bailey's response was to shift slightly, pressing even more firmly against her legs. His warm breath came in steady, even patterns against her arm. No judgment, no doubt, just unwavering presence. Outside the screen, the courtroom buzzed with barely contained chaos. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, their faces reflecting shock at what they'd just witnessed. The gallery erupted in fierce whispers, reporters frantically typing notes on their phones, legal observers debating whether they'd just seen a career-ending mistake, spectators simply trying to process the explosive moment. At the prosecution table, Jennifer Chen sat with her hands clasped tightly, fighting to keep the smile off her face. In 15 years of trial work, she'd never seen a defense attorney self-destruct so spectacularly. Marcus Webb had just committed professional suicide, and he'd done it in front of 12 jurors who would never forget watching him deliberately interfere with a disabled witness's medical accommodation. The defense table, now pushed back a humiliating 6 feet, sat in disarray. The junior attorneys gathered dropped files and scattered papers, their faces pale. Richard Peterson, Sarah's former supervisor, had gone gray. He leaned toward the attorney next to him and whispered urgently, "Can they dismiss the case because of this? Can we claim mistrial?" But Marcus Webb stood alone in the center of the courtroom, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. He'd made a catastrophic error in judgment, and he knew it. The calculating part of his brain that had won so many cases was already racing through damage control scenarios, but another part, the part driven by ego and the intoxication of dominating witnesses, quite accept that he'd crossed a line. "Mr. Webb." Judge Brennan's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. The judge stood at the entrance to his chambers, his face still flushed with anger, one hand gripping the doorframe so hard his knuckles were white. "My chambers. Now, Bailiff Torres, bring water and ensure Ms. Mitchell has privacy. Ms. Chen, you're welcome to join us." The walk to chambers felt like a funeral march. Webb's shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, each step taking him closer to a reckoning he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. Jennifer Chen followed at a discreet distance, her legal pad clutched against her chest, ready to document every word. Judge Brennan's chambers were exactly what one would expect from a judge who'd served for over 2 decades. Walls lined with law books, framed degrees and commendations, photos from landmark cases. But there was also unexpected warmth. A coffee maker on a side table, a worn leather couch, a small photo of Brennan with his late wife and their 3 golden retrievers. The judge didn't sit behind his imposing desk. Instead, he stood by the window, his back to them, staring out at the Denver skyline. The silence stretched for 30 seconds, 45, a full minute. Webb shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer remained perfectly still. When Brennan finally turned around, his fury had crystallized into something colder and more dangerous than his earlier explosion. "In 42 years of legal practice," he began, his voice quiet and precise, "I have never, and I mean never, witnessed such a flagrant violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act in a courtroom. What you did out there wasn't just unethical, Mr. Webb. It was potentially criminal." Webb opened his mouth to respond, but Brennan raised a hand, silencing him. "That service dog is medical equipment under federal law. It is performing a critical medical function for a witness who is lawfully entitled to that accommodation. You deliberately interfered with that function." The judge moved closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Let me put this in terms you might understand, counselor. What you did is the legal equivalent of disconnecting someone's oxygen tank, of removing someone's hearing aid, of kicking away a person's wheelchair." "Your Honor, I was simply conducting a vigorous cross-examination." "Vigorous?" Brennan's voice rose sharply. "You positioned yourself to physically block the dog's line of sight to its handler during an active medical intervention. That's not vigorous examination. That's assault on a disabled person." Jennifer Chen scribbled notes furiously, documenting every word for the inevitable appeals and bar complaints that would follow. Webb's face had gone pale, but his attorney's instinct for self-preservation kicked in. "Your Honor, I apologize if my positioning was insensitive, but surely you're not suggesting that my physical location in the courtroom constitutes—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Webb. I'm telling you exactly what I observed." Brennan moved to his desk and pulled out a thick binder. "I took judicial notice training on disability accommodations just last year. Do you know what it says about service animals?" He flipped open the binder, though clearly he'd memorized the relevant passages. "Service animals must maintain visual contact with their handlers to monitor for medical distress. Deliberately blocking that visual contact during a medical event constitutes interference with a disability accommodation under 42 U.S.C. Section 12,182. He slammed the binder shut, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. "But here's what troubles me even more, counselor. Your entire cross-examination was designed to exploit Ms. Mitchell's disability. You attacked her mental health history. You questioned her credibility based on her psychiatric treatment. You used aggressive tactics specifically calibrated to trigger an anxiety attack, and when her legally mandated medical accommodation began to work, you interfered with it. Your Honor, the witness's mental state is relevant to her reliability. Her diagnosis is irrelevant." Brennan's voice thundered through the chambers. "Her credibility is based on the evidence she presents, not on whether she has PTSD or takes anxiety medication. You wouldn't question a diabetic witness's credibility because they take insulin. You wouldn't suggest a cancer survivor's testimony is unreliable because they underwent chemotherapy. But you felt perfectly comfortable attacking this woman for seeking treatment for mental health conditions. Conditions, I might add, that your own client likely caused through their illegal retaliation. Webb's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He had no response that wouldn't dig his hole deeper. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Webb. When we return to that courtroom, you will maintain a minimum distance of 5 feet from the witness at all times. You will not block the dog's line of sight. You will not make any references to Ms. Mitchell's mental health unless directly relevant to impeaching specific testimony. And if I see one more intimidation tactic, one more aggressive move, one more attempt to exploit her disability, I will hold you in contempt. I will report you to the Colorado Bar for disciplinary action, and I will personally ensure that every attorney in this district knows exactly what you did today. The judge straightened, his face carved from granite. Do I make myself absolutely clear? Yes, Your Honor. Webb's voice was barely above a whisper. Good, now get out of my chambers. Ms. Chen, please check on your witness and let me know when she's ready to continue. We'll resume in 30 minutes. As Webb stumbled out, Jennifer Chen paused at the door. Your Honor, thank you. What you did out there. Brennan shook his head, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. I should have stopped it sooner. The moment he started attacking her mental health history, I should have intervened. He moved back to the window, staring out. My daughter has PTSD, Ms. Chen, from a car accident 5 years ago. She has a service dog too, a golden retriever just like Bailey. Jennifer's eyes widened with understanding. If someone did to her what Mr. Webb did to your witness, Brennan's voice trailed off, thick with emotion. Let's just say I recognized every single tactic he was using, and I will not allow it in my courtroom. Not now, not ever. Jennifer nodded, a lump forming in her throat. We'll be ready in 30 minutes, Your Honor. As she left, Brennan remained at the window. In the reflection, he could see the courtroom through the glass panels of his door. He could just make out the privacy screen where Sarah Mitchell was still recovering, where Bailey was still providing the support and dignity that the legal system had nearly stripped away. Judge Harold Brennan had always believed that a courtroom should be a place where truth prevailed over tactics, where justice mattered more than clever argumentation. Today, he'd almost forgotten that principle, but not anymore. When they resumed, things were going to be very different. The 30-minute recess stretched like taffy, each minute feeling like an hour to everyone waiting in courtroom 4B behind the privacy screen. Sarah Mitchell sat on the floor, her back against Bailey's solid warmth, trying to piece herself back together. The bailiff, Torres, had brought her water in a paper cup that trembled in her shaking hands. She'd spilled the first one entirely. Take your time, Torres said gently, surprising her. He was a large, intimidating man with a shaved head and arms the size of tree trunks, but his voice held unexpected kindness. Judge Brennan's not rushing you. Trust me, I've worked for him 15 years. I've never seen him that angry. Sarah looked up through tear-swollen eyes. He's angry at me. At you, Torres actually laughed, though it was a bitter sound. Ms. Mitchell, he's about to end that defense attorney's career. You just sit here, breathe, and know that when you go back out there, things are going to be very different. Different? Sarah wanted to believe it, but 3 years of being dismissed, discredited, and gaslit had taught her not to hope too much. Still, as Bailey's steady heartbeat thrummed against her back, she felt something stirring in her chest, not panic this time, but something sharper. Anger, maybe, or determination. Jennifer Chen appeared around the edge of the screen, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes gleaming with barely suppressed excitement. Sarah, how are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, Sarah admitted, but I'm still here. Yes, you are, Jennifer knelt down beside her. And you need to know something. What just happened out there? That wasn't a setback, that was a gift. She leaned closer, her voice dropping. Marcus Webb just handed us this case on a silver platter. Every single juror watched him deliberately interfere with your medical accommodation. They watched Judge Brennan, the toughest judge in this district, tear him apart for it. When you go back on that stand, you're not the unstable witness anymore. You're the disabled woman who was attacked by a bully, and you survived. Sarah's fingers tightened in Bailey's fur. He made me look crazy. No, Jennifer corrected firmly. He made himself look cruel. There's a difference, and the jury knows it. They're not questioning your sanity, Sarah. They're questioning his humanity. Through the gap in the privacy screen, Sarah could see slivers of the courtroom. The defense table pushed back those humiliating 6 feet, where Marcus Webb sat with his head in his hands. The jury box, where several jurors were whispering urgently among themselves. The gallery, packed with reporters who were undoubtedly already drafting headlines. Attorney attacks disabled witness. Judge stops trial after ADA violation. Pharmaceutical trial explodes in courtroom drama. A commotion near the courtroom doors caught her attention. A woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed, was arguing with the security guard. "I'm Marcus Webb's wife," she hissed urgently. "I need to speak with him immediately." The guard shook his head. "Court's in recess, ma'am. No one in or out until the judge returns." Sarah watched as Mrs. Webb's face crumpled with what looked like despair. Even the attorney's wife knew this was catastrophic. At the prosecution table, Jennifer's co-counsel, a younger attorney named David Ramirez, was reviewing their notes. "Jennifer," he called softly, "the media's going crazy. I've got 17 requests for comment, and TMZ just called asking if we're planning to sue Webb personally for discrimination." "Tell them all no comment," Jennifer replied, but she was smiling. "Let the story speak for itself." The defense team was in worse shape. 2 of the junior attorneys were on their phones, presumably with their firm's managing partners, their faces ashen. Richard Peterson, Sarah's former supervisor, sat completely still, staring at nothing. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Because that's exactly what was happening. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the door to Judge Brennan's chambers opened. The judge emerged, his face composed now but still carrying the weight of barely controlled fury. He'd changed his robe. The first one had a coffee stain from where he'd slammed his mug down in rage, and his hair was freshly combed. But his eyes were steel. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the courtroom scrambled to its feet. Judge Brennan took his seat, surveying the courtroom with the air of a general surveying a battlefield. His gaze lingered on Marcus Webb, who stood ramrod straight, his earlier confidence replaced by something approaching fear. "Be seated." The judge waited until every person had settled before speaking. "Before we continue, I have several matters to address on the record." The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine. "First, I am issuing a formal warning to defense counsel, Mr. Marcus Webb, for violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act during these proceedings. The record will reflect that Mr. Webb deliberately interfered with a service animal performing medical duties by physically blocking the animal's line of sight to its handler during an active medical intervention." Webb's face went from pale to scarlet. "Second, I am establishing the following conditions for the remainder of this trial. Defense counsel will maintain a minimum distance of 5 feet from the witness stand at all times. Defense counsel will not make any references to Ms. Mitchell's mental health treatment unless such references are directly relevant to impeaching specific factual testimony. Defense counsel will not engage in any intimidation tactics, including but not limited to sudden loud noises, aggressive physical movements, or blocking the witness's view of her service animal." Brennan paused, letting his words sink in. Several jurors were nodding, their expressions approving. "Third, I want to address the jury directly." This was highly unusual, and every attorney in the room sat up straighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed an incident that should never have occurred in any courtroom. I want you to understand that Ms. Mitchell's use of a service animal is a legally protected medical accommodation. The fact that she requires such accommodation has no bearing whatsoever on the truthfulness or reliability of her testimony. You are instructed to evaluate her testimony based solely on the evidence presented, not on the existence or nature of her disability. One juror, an older woman in the front row, wiped tears from her eyes. Another, a middle-aged man, glared openly at Marcus Webb. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice hardening, I am referring this matter to the Colorado Bar Association for investigation of potential ethical violations by Mr. Webb. I am also ordering that a complete transcript of today's proceedings be prepared and submitted to the bar within 48 hours. At the defense table, the lead partner from Webb's firm, who had arrived during the recess after frantic phone calls, actually put his head in his hands. Mr. Webb, Judge Brennan's voice could have frozen fire, do you understand these conditions? Webb stood, his voice hoarse. Yes, Your Honor. Do you wish to continue with your cross-examination under these conditions, or would you prefer to yield back to the prosecution? It was a trap wrapped in courtesy. If Webb continued, every question would be scrutinized. If he yielded, it would look like retreat, like admission that he had nothing legitimate to ask. Webb's throat worked as he swallowed. Your Honor, I would like to continue, but perhaps we could. There will be no perhaps, Counselor. You will comply with these conditions or you will be held in contempt. Choose now. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the reporters had stopped typing, waiting for Webb's response. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Webb said, I yield back, Your Honor. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Brennan's gavel came down once, restoring order. Very well, Ms. Chen, do you have any redirect examination? Jennifer stood, smoothing her suit jacket. Yes, Your Honor. May I have a moment to confer with my witness? Granted. Jennifer walked to the privacy screen, which Torres was already beginning to dismantle. She found Sarah still sitting with Bailey, but something had changed. The broken, defeated look was gone. In its place was something harder, sharper. He gave up, Sarah said, disbelief coloring her voice. He had no choice, Jennifer replied. You broke him just by surviving what he tried to do to you. Now I need to ask, are you ready to finish this? Because I promise you, no one is going to attack you again. You have the floor, Sarah. It's time to tell your story the way it deserves to be told. Sarah looked at Bailey, who gazed back at her with absolute trust. Then she looked past Jennifer to the courtroom, to the jury who had watched her be assaulted and defended, to the judge who had stood up for her when no one else would, to the defense team that now sat in ruins. For 3 years she had been silenced, dismissed, made to feel small and crazy and worthless. Not anymore. Sarah Mitchell stood up, straightened her shoulders, and said in a voice that didn't shake, I'm ready. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she actually believed it. The privacy screen collapsed with a metallic whisper, and Sarah Mitchell emerged like a phoenix from ashes. The transformation wasn't dramatic. She didn't suddenly stand taller or walk with a swagger, but something fundamental had shifted in her bearing. Bailey walked beside her, his tail at a confident angle, sensing the change in his handler's energy. Every eye in courtroom 4B tracked her movement back to the witness stand. The jurors leaned forward unconsciously. The reporters' pens hovered over their notebooks. Even Marcus Webb, sitting in his humiliation 5 feet back from where he'd once dominated, couldn't help but watch. Sarah took her seat, and this time when she placed her hand on Bailey's head, it wasn't a desperate grab for stability. It was a gesture of partnership, of strength. Judge Brennan's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Ms. Mitchell, are you ready to continue? Yes, Your Honor. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake, not anymore. Ms. Chen, your witness. Jennifer Chen approached the witness stand. But unlike Webb, she maintained a respectful distance and her body language was open, non-threatening. "Sarah, I'd like to take you back to March 2022. You mentioned finding a hidden database. Can you walk us through exactly what happened that day?" Sarah took a breath, feeling Bailey's warmth against her legs. "I was running quality control checks on the Phase III trial data for Arthro Relief. It was routine work I'd done hundreds of times. But that day, I noticed something wrong." "What did you notice?" "The patient ID numbers weren't sequential. We used a numbering system that should have gone 1, 2, 3, and so on. But I was seeing 1, 2, 5, 8. Numbers were missing." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "At first, I thought it was a data entry error. But when I tried to locate the missing patient files, they weren't in our main system." Jennifer nodded encouragingly. "What did you do next?" "I went to my supervisor, Richard Peterson." Sarah's eyes flicked briefly to the man in question, who wouldn't meet her gaze. "He told me it was probably archived data that had been cleaned from the active database. He said not to worry about it." "But you did worry about it." "Yes, because pharmaceutical data doesn't just disappear. Every patient enrolled in a trial has to be accounted for, especially in FDA submissions. So I dug deeper." Jennifer pulled up a document on the courtroom's display screen. "Is this the hidden database you discovered?" Sarah studied the screen and a small, sad smile crossed her face. "Yes, that's it. Database file name, YARI Archive Confidential. I stands for adverse events." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Brennan's gavel came down gently, not to silence but to acknowledge. "Sarah, what did this database contain?" 47 patient records. All of them had experienced severe adverse reactions to Arthro Relief. Acute liver damage, liver failure, elevated liver enzymes indicating toxicity. 16 of those patients died. Jennifer let the words hang in the air before continuing. "Were these adverse events reported to the FDA?" "No, that's why they were in a separate database. Someone at Meridian had deliberately hidden them from the official trial data submitted for FDA approval." Objection. One of the junior defense attorneys shot up. Webb remained seated, looking defeated. Speculation. The witness cannot know the intent. Sustained, Judge Brennan said, but his tone was perfunctory. "Ms. Mitchell, please stick to what you observed directly." "I observed," Sarah said carefully, "that these 47 cases were not included in any of the safety reports submitted to the FDA. I observed that they were stored in a database with confidential in the file name. And I observed that when I brought this to Mr. Peterson's attention, he became very angry." "Tell us about that conversation." Sarah's hand tightened briefly in Bailey's fur, then relaxed. "He called me into his office the next day. There were 2 other executives there, Dr. Catherine Yates and someone from legal whose name I didn't catch. Mr. Peterson told me I had accessed files above my clearance level. He said the data I'd found was from an earlier trial phase that had been superseded by later data. He told me to delete any copies I'd made and never mention it again." "Did you believe him?" "No, I've worked in pharmaceutical data analysis for over a decade. You don't supersede adverse event data. You report it. Every case has to be documented and submitted to the FDA, especially deaths. What he was describing wasn't just bad science, it was criminal fraud." Jennifer paced slowly, giving the jury time to absorb this. "What happened next?" "I made copies of everything," Sarah said, her voice hardening with resolve. "Every file in that hidden database, every email exchange I could find referencing it. I saved it all to a USB drive and to an encrypted cloud storage account." "Why did you feel the need to do that?" "Because I knew they were going to destroy the evidence. And I was right. 2 days after that meeting with Mr. Peterson, the hidden database was deleted from the company's servers. If I hadn't made copies, there would be no proof it ever existed." Judge Brennan interjected unexpectedly. Ms. Mitchell, I want to ask you something directly. Every head in the courtroom swiveled toward him. It was highly unusual for a judge to question a witness during redirect, but Brennan's expression made clear he didn't care about convention at this moment. You've been attacked today, your mental health questioned, your credibility challenged, your disability exploited. Why are you still sitting here? Why put yourself through this? The courtroom went silent. Sarah looked at the judge, and for the first time tears filled her eyes, but they weren't tears of weakness or defeat. Because 16 people died, Your Honor. 16 people who took a medication they believed was safe because they trusted the FDA approval process. They trusted that companies like Meridian were telling the truth about their drugs, and they died because of that trust. Her voice broke, but she pushed through. One of them was named Jennifer Wilson. She was 53. She loved gardening. She had arthritis in her hands so bad she could barely hold her grandchildren. The drug gave her hands back for 6 weeks. Then her liver failed and she died in the hospital while her family watched. Sarah pulled a photograph from her pocket. Jennifer Chen had helped her prepare it as evidence. This is Jennifer. I found her obituary while researching the patient cases. Her family never knew that Meridian had hidden data about liver toxicity. They thought it was just a tragic medical complication, but it wasn't. It was preventable. It was murder. The photograph was displayed on the courtroom screen. A smiling woman with gray hair and laugh lines around her eyes, surrounded by grandchildren in a garden. One of the jurors, the older woman in the front row, openly wept. I'm sitting here, Sarah continued, her voice steadying, because someone has to speak for the people who can't speak for themselves anymore. Someone has to tell the truth, even if it costs me everything. Even if people think I'm crazy. Even if, she glanced at Marcus Webb, who was staring at his hands, even if lawyers try to destroy me for it. Judge Brennan nodded slowly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. That takes extraordinary courage. Jennifer Chen, who had been standing frozen during this exchange, collected herself. Sarah, do you have the USB drive with the copied files? Yes, I brought it with me. Sarah pulled it from her jacket pocket. Everything is here. Every patient record. Every internal email discussing how to hide the data. Every document proving Meridian knew their drug was killing people and sold it anyway. Jennifer took the USB drive as if it were made of gold. Your Honor, I'd like to admit this into evidence as Prosecution Exhibit 47. So admitted. Brennan's gavel came down with finality. At the defense table, Richard Peterson put his face in his hands. The lead partner from Webb's firm was frantically writing notes, probably calculating settlement figures. Marcus Webb sat motionless, the wreckage of his career surrounding him like debris from a shipwreck. But in the jury box, something remarkable was happening. The 12 strangers who had watched Sarah nearly break under cross-examination were now looking at her with something approaching awe. They'd witnessed her vulnerability, her struggle, her near collapse. And then they'd watched her rise from those ashes to speak truth with a clarity that couldn't be shaken. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a survivor, a warrior, a hero. Jennifer had one final question. Sarah, knowing everything you know now, knowing that coming forward would cost you your job, your reputation, your mental health, knowing you'd be attacked and called crazy and dragged through this trial, would you still do it? Sarah looked at Bailey, then at the photograph of Jennifer Wilson still displayed on the screen, then at the jury. Every single time, she said, because someone has to fight for what's right even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Judge Brennan's gavel came down softly. No further questions, Your Honor, Jennifer said. Any recross, Mr. Webb? The judge's tone made clear what he thought of that possibility. Webb stood slowly, and for a moment Sarah tensed, but when he spoke his voice was hollow. No, Your Honor, the defense has nothing further. Because really, what else was there to say? Sarah Mitchell had just won. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall courtroom windows, casting golden bars of light across the floor like a visual representation of justice itself. Sarah Mitchell remained on the witness stand, but the trembling, uncertain woman from this morning had been replaced by someone forged in fire. Bailey sat beside her, no longer just a medical necessity, but a symbol of resilience. Jennifer Chen returned to the prosecution table and retrieved a thick binder. "Sarah, I'd like to go through some of the specific documents you preserved. Let's start with this email." She displayed it on the courtroom screen. "Can you identify this?" Sarah studied it, and her expression hardened. "That's an internal email from Dr. Catherine Yates to Richard Peterson and Thomas Crane. The subject line is AR Trial Elevated LFTs Issue." LFTs. Liver Function Tests. It's medical shorthand. The email is dated January 15, 2022, 3 months before the FDA approval hearing. Jennifer nodded. "Can you read the relevant portion for the jury?" Sarah's voice was clear and unwavering now. "Richard and Tom, we have a significant problem with the phase III data. 23 patients now showing ALT and AST levels more than 10x normal range. 5 have progressed to acute liver failure. The correlation to AR dosage is unmistakable. We need to discuss containment strategy before the FDA review. These cases cannot be included in the final data submission or will never get approval. Recommend we classify them as pre-existing conditions or concurrent medication interactions. Catherine." The courtroom was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Several jurors were taking notes furiously. "These cases cannot be included," Jennifer repeated. "That's pretty clear intent, isn't it?" Objection. The junior defense attorney stood weakly. "Calls for speculation." Overruled. Judge Brennan's voice was ice. "The witness can interpret a document in her professional capacity. Continue." Sarah continued, and with each document, each email, each piece of evidence, the picture became devastatingly clear. Meridian Pharmaceuticals hadn't just made a mistake or overlooked a few cases. They had engaged in systematic, deliberate fraud. "This email," Sarah held up another printout, "is from Thomas Crane himself. The CEO," he wrote, "Catherine, Richard, I don't care how you handle the liver cases, but they stay out of the FDA submission. We've invested $847 million in AR development. We're not going to let a few statistical outliers destroy our profit projections. Make it disappear." A juror in the back row audibly gasped. "A few statistical outliers," Jennifer repeated, her voice dripping with contempt. "He's talking about human beings, people with families, people who trusted his company." Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. "And they did make it disappear. They created the hidden database, moved all the problematic cases into it, and submitted falsified safety data to the FDA. The approval was based on a lie." Jennifer pulled up another document. "What about this one?" Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she recognized it, not from fear now, but from rage. "That's the document that cost me everything. It's an internal memo I wrote to Richard Peterson, copying human resources and the company's ethics hotline. I detailed everything I'd found. I explained that lives were at stake. I begged them to come forward voluntarily before the FDA discovered the fraud." "What happened after you sent that memo?" "Nothing, for 3 days, nothing. Then Mr. Peterson called me into his office." Sarah's voice took on a harder edge. "There were 2 security guards with him. He told me I was being terminated immediately for gross violation of data security protocols and unauthorized access to confidential files. They escorted me out of the building like a criminal. I wasn't allowed to get my personal belongings. They were mailed to me 3 weeks later, after they'd gone through everything." "Did they say anything else?" "Yes." Sarah's eyes found Richard Peterson in the courtroom. He looked like he wanted to crawl under the defense table. "Mr. Peterson told me that if I tried to take this to the FDA or the media, Meridian's legal team would destroy me. He said, and I remember his exact words, 'No one will believe a paranoid woman with a documented history of mental instability. We'll make sure everyone knows you're crazy. We'll have you committed if necessary.' Then he smiled and said, "Good luck finding another job in this industry." The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked down repeatedly. Order, order in this court. But the damage, or rather, the revelation, was complete. The jury wasn't looking at Sarah with skepticism anymore. They were looking at Richard Peterson with disgust. They were looking at the entire defense table with barely concealed contempt. Jennifer let the moment breathe before continuing. "Sarah, you mentioned earlier that 16 people died. Do you have information on the others?" "Yes, I researched every single patient in that hidden database." Sarah pulled out a folder she'd been keeping close. Their names were Jennifer Wilson, Michael Torres, Patricia Chen, Robert Davidson, Maria Garcia, John Smith, Linda Thompson. She read all 16 names slowly and clearly, giving each one weight and dignity. These weren't statistics. They were people. They had families, dreams, futures that Meridian Pharmaceuticals stole from them. By the time she finished reading the last name, Daniel Foster, age 41, father of 3, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Even Judge Brennan had to pause to collect himself. "After you were fired," Jennifer continued, "what did you do?" "I tried everything. I filed a complaint with the FDA, but Meridian had already submitted their approval package. The FDA told me they'd investigate, but months passed with no response. I later found out that Meridian had sent their lawyers to the FDA claiming I was a disgruntled former employee making false allegations. I contacted 3 different journalists, but they all said they couldn't run the story without corroboration from someone still inside Meridian, and everyone there was too scared to talk." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "I went to a lawyer, 5 different lawyers actually. None of them would take my case. They said going after a pharmaceutical giant was too expensive, too risky. One of them told me to let it go and get on with my life. But I couldn't let it go, not when I knew the truth, not when people were still dying." How many more people died after Arthrorelief was approved by the FDA? Sarah's answer was devastating. "Based on adverse event reports I've tracked through public databases, at least 37 more people have died from liver failure after taking Arthrorelief, and that's only the ones that were officially reported. The real number is probably much higher." Jennifer turned to face the jury directly. "So we're not talking about 16 deaths anymore. We're talking about 53 confirmed deaths, with potentially many more, all because Meridian Pharmaceuticals decided that profit was more important than human life." "Objection." The defense attorney's voice was desperate, inflammatory, prejudicial. "Overruled." Judge Brennan's face was stone. "The numbers speak for themselves, counselor." Jennifer walked slowly back to the prosecution table, then turned for one final question. "Sarah, I need to ask you something personal. This fight cost you everything, your career, your financial security, your mental health. You've been called crazy, unreliable, delusional. You've been hospitalized, you've suffered. Was it worth it?" Sarah looked at Bailey, then at the photographs of the deceased patients still visible on the screen, then directly at the jury. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 3 years of suffering, but also the strength of absolute conviction. "I lost my career, yes. I lost my savings paying for therapy and medication. I lost relationships because people believed Meridian's lies about me. I developed PTSD from the retaliation and threats. There were nights when I didn't think I could survive another day." She paused, her hand resting on Bailey's head. "But if I hadn't fought, if I'd stayed silent, those 53 deaths would have been covered up forever. Their families would never have known the truth. And Meridian would still be selling poison while counting their profits." Sarah's eyes blazed with fierce determination. "So yes, it was worth it, because some things are more important than being comfortable or safe or believed. The truth is more important. Justice is more important. Those 16 people, those 53 people, their lives were important. And someone had to stand up and say so, even if that someone was just a crazy woman with a dog." The silence that followed was profound. Then something unprecedented happened. One juror began to clap, then another, then all 12. Judge Brennan didn't stop them. He simply sat back and watched as Sarah Mitchell, the woman who'd been called unreliable, unstable, and unbelievable, received a standing ovation from the very people who would decide this case. Marcus Webb stared at his hands. Richard Peterson wept openly. And Thomas Crane, the CEO who'd ordered evidence destroyed, finally looked afraid. The truth, after 3 long years, had finally come to light. 3 days. That's how long the trial continued after Sarah Mitchell's testimony. 3 days of expert witnesses, document analysis, and closing arguments. But everyone in that courtroom knew the outcome had been decided the moment Sarah read those 16 names, the moment she transformed from a broken witness into an unshakable force of truth. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Sarah spent that time in a small witness room down the hall, unable to eat, unable to sit still, unable to do anything but pace while Bailey followed her back and forth like a golden shadow. Jennifer Chen had told her the short deliberation was a good sign, but Sarah had learned not to hope too much. Hope was a dangerous thing when you'd been disappointed as many times as she had. "What if they don't believe me?" Sarah whispered to Bailey, kneeling down to bury her face in his fur. "What if all of this was for nothing?" Bailey's response was to lick her cheek and press his solid warmth against her. He didn't need words. His presence said everything. "I believe you. I'm here. You already won just by speaking." When the bailiff knocked on the door at 4:47 p.m., Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "They're back," Torres said simply, but his expression held something that looked almost like pride. The walk back to courtroom 4B felt like walking to her own execution or coronation. She wasn't sure which. The gallery had filled to capacity, with overflow spectators lining the back wall. News cameras waited outside, prohibited from entering but ready to capture reactions the moment anyone emerged. Sarah took her seat beside Jennifer at the prosecution table. Across the aisle, the defense team looked like survivors of a shipwreck, hollow-eyed, defeated, bracing for impact. Marcus Webb wasn't among them. He'd been removed from the case after Judge Brennan's formal complaint to the Bar Association. A senior partner named Gerald Morrison had taken over, but there was nothing he could do to undo the damage. Richard Peterson sat in the first row behind the defense table, his face gray and aged 10 years in 3 days. Dr. Catherine Yates clutched a tissue, her hands shaking. And Thomas Crane, the CEO who'd ordered evidence destroyed, maintained his mask of entitled calm, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harold Brennan." The judge entered, his expression unreadable. He'd watched 3 days of devastating evidence unfold: internal emails, expert testimony on pharmaceutical fraud, statistical analysis proving Meridian's data manipulation. Through it all, he'd maintained strict judicial neutrality, but Sarah thought she'd caught glimpses of carefully controlled rage. "Be seated." Brennan surveyed the packed courtroom. "I understand the jury has reached a verdict." "We have, Your Honor." The jury foreman stood, a retired engineer named Robert Chen who'd taken meticulous notes throughout the trial. "On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the Federal Drug Administration, how do you find the defendants?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom exploded. Reporters bolted for the doors. Thomas Crane's face went white. Richard Peterson made a sound like a wounded animal. Behind the prosecution table, family members of the deceased victims, who'd attended every day of trial, wept with relief. Judge Brennan's gavel crashed down repeatedly. "Order, we're not finished." The foreman continued through all 17 charges: falsification of clinical trial data, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Every single count came back the same: guilty, guilty, guilty. By the time the foreman finished, Thomas Crane had collapsed back into his chair. Dr. Catherine Yates was openly sobbing. Richard Peterson stared at nothing, his career and freedom evaporating before his eyes. But Sarah Mitchell sat frozen, unable to process what she was hearing. 3 years of being called crazy. 3 years of having her reality questioned, her sanity attacked, her truth denied. And in 4 hours and 17 minutes, 12 strangers had looked at all the evidence and said, she was right. She was telling the truth. She was the only one who was brave enough to speak. Jennifer Chen grabbed Sarah's hand and squeezed. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "You actually did it." Judge Brennan wasn't done. "The jury has returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Before I dismiss you, I want to address something." He looked directly at the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, this trial required you to hear difficult testimony and review disturbing evidence. But I want you to know that your service here today represents the justice system working exactly as it should. You listened. You evaluated evidence fairly. You reached a verdict based on facts, not prejudice. Thank you for your service." The jurors nodded, several wiping tears from their eyes. The older woman in the front row, who'd wept during Sarah's testimony, caught Sarah's eye and mouthed, "Thank you." "This court will reconvene in 2 weeks for sentencing," Brennan announced. "The defendants will remain free on bond, but I'm tripling the bond amounts and confiscating all passports. Bailiff, take them into custody for processing." As security moved forward, Thomas Crane finally lost his composure. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, standing abruptly. "We'll appeal. We'll fight this. You haven't won anything." Judge Brennan's expression could have frozen fire. "Mr. Crane, I suggest you remain silent before you compound your legal problems. But since you raised the subject of appeals, let me be clear." He leaned forward, his voice carrying throughout the silent courtroom. "Your company deliberately falsified safety data, resulting in at least 53 confirmed deaths. You personally ordered evidence destroyed. You orchestrated a campaign to discredit and destroy a whistleblower who was trying to save lives. No appeals court will look kindly on those facts." He paused, letting his words sink in. "At sentencing, I will be recommending the maximum penalty on every single count. Corporate fraud that kills people isn't a white-collar crime, Mr. Crane. It's murder, and I intend to treat it as such." The color drained completely from Crane's face as security led him away. When the courtroom finally cleared, Sarah remained seated, still processing. Bailey rested his head on her lap, sensing her emotional overload. Jennifer sat beside her, giving her space to feel everything she needed to feel. "They believed me," Sarah finally whispered. "After everything, they believed me." "Because you told the truth," Jennifer replied. "And the truth, when spoken with courage, is unshakable." Judge Brennan approached from his bench, highly unusual, but this had been an unusual trial from the start. "Ms. Mitchell, may I speak with you?" Sarah stood quickly, Bailey rising with her. "Of course, Your Honor." Brennan's stern expression softened into something approaching warmth. "What you did required extraordinary courage. I've been on the bench for 23 years, and I've never seen a witness face the kind of attack you endured and still stand firm. You should be proud." Tears finally spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I just wanted someone to listen, to believe that those people mattered." "They mattered," Brennan said firmly. "And because of you, their families will finally have answers, justice, closure." He glanced at Bailey. "Your dog is remarkable, by the way. My daughter has a service dog too, golden retriever like Bailey. She has PTSD from a car accident." Understanding flashed in Sarah's eyes. That's why I recognized every tactic Marcus Webb was using," Brennan confirmed. "And why I won't tolerate that behavior in my courtroom. Ever." He handed her a card. "This is the Colorado Bar Association's complaint number for Webb. Your experience will be part of the formal investigation. He'll likely face suspension or disbarment." Outside the courthouse, a mob of reporters waited. Sarah hesitated at the top of the stairs, overwhelmed by the crowd and cameras, but Jennifer touched her arm. "You don't have to say anything, But if you want to, now's your chance." Sarah looked at Bailey, who gazed back with steady confidence. Then she looked at the crowd, at the cameras that would carry her words across the country, and made a decision. She stepped forward to the microphone bank. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. 3 years ago, I discovered that Meridian Pharmaceuticals was hiding evidence that their drug was killing people. When I tried to report it, they fired me, threatened me, and tried to convince everyone that I was mentally ill and unreliable." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "They almost succeeded. There were days I believed them, days I thought maybe I was crazy for fighting so hard." She reached down to touch Bailey's head. "But I had help. This is Bailey. He's my service dog, and he saved my life more times than I can count. When I couldn't trust my own mind, I could trust him. When I couldn't find my voice, he gave me strength." Sarah looked directly into the cameras. "Today, a jury said I was telling the truth. Today, justice was served. But it shouldn't have been this hard. Whistleblowers shouldn't have to sacrifice everything to do the right thing. People with disabilities shouldn't have to fight for basic respect in courtrooms. And corporations that value profit over human life should face consequences swift and severe." She paused, emotion thick in her throat. "I did this for Jennifer Wilson, Michael Tors, Patricia Chen, and the 13 others who died before Arthur Relief was approved. I did it for the 37 who died after. And I did it for everyone who will be protected because Meridian can't hurt anyone else. If my story inspires even one person to speak truth to power, to fight even when it seems hopeless, then every moment of suffering was worth it." Sarah stepped back from the microphones and reporters erupted with questions, but she didn't answer them. She'd said what she needed to say. As she walked away with Bailey at her side and Jennifer beside her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: peace. The kind that comes from knowing you did the right thing, regardless of the cost. Behind them, the courthouse stood as a monument to justice served. Inside, Judge Brennan watched from his window, nodding with satisfaction. And somewhere, 16 souls rested a little easier, knowing their deaths had not been in vain. The end.